It's my pleasure to welcome you all to the MnRI Seminar series for the summer. It's my distinct pleasure to introduce you Professor Suma Jacob. Is a great colleague. There are several projects that she has, not only with me, but with several. Some of them are members of the audience. Suma received her degrees from the University of Chicago, and she's on the faculty of Psychiatry and also has a joint appointment in Pediatrics, and is going to talk about using technology to study disorders and shift neurodevelopment. So without further ado, the virtual podium is yours, Suma.
All right. So today I'm going to talk about several projects that I've been collaborating with people in computer science and departments focused on innovative computational approaches or technology to look at neurodevelopmental disorders. And one of the reasons we're doing this is because clinically, when you study behavior in brain, you don't have access to the brain directly like you do other health disorders. And you often need rating scales or those kind of ways to measure symptoms. And I was just going to go back a little bit. I was going to comment that the CAN lab, which I am part of, I co-lead with Christine Canalia, whose photos down there. And both of us work on neurodevelopmental disorders. And I've done a lot of work with autism and OCD, and Christine has a lot of expertise in Tourette's. All of those come together. And that's what we're kind of labeling neurodevelopmental disorders. And they're comorbid, meaning that children who have one will often have the other. And these all relate to similar brain pathways during development. And so technology and our new innovative approaches may be really helpful in improving assessment. And I'll talk about a study that we're doing with early assessment that may lead to early intervention, and we have a lot of data saying that early intervention leads to better outcomes, as well as eye tracking and other physiology measures. We're also developing a lot of tasks, decision-making tasks and other types of tasks that may lead to better diagnoses. And the goal of all of these are to help prioritize the specific deficits or challenges individuals have during development and improve treatments. So if someone has a very complex picture with multiple things, the order in which you treat things and the specific things you target may be important. And right now, we're not great at picking those things, those details up. And often it's a one-size-fits-all kind of approach, like this treatment is targeted for all children with autism rather than looking at all the differences each child may have. Similarly, I'm going to talk a little bit about computerized training tasks and programs that we're pairing with learning therapies also as direct treatment approaches. So one of the biggest challenges of being a developmental clinician is we work with children and adults from very young ages. So some of the projects I'm doing are working with infants all the way to young adults, and some of the studies I do have people in their 50s. And these different disorders are frequently diagnosed at different times. And so often autism is picked up early. We're getting better at picking it up. 4 to 5 is sort of the average age, but you can pick up clues or cues or symptoms very early on. And I'll talk about our work trying to get better at doing that. OCD is also often, it first presents, or you can really pick it up around age 4, 5, 6. And then Another subset you really pick up around puberty, and another subset you pick up around adult events like peripartum or around labor and delivery. And I have a background in neuroendocrinology, so hormones and development may be related to when these come along. Similarly with tic disorder, it's that similar age, 4 to 7 to 8, and you can continue, it continues to, for some individuals, get better over certain time periods in development, and some it gets worse, and there are more symptoms during puberty. And so we had, the other thing to kind of hold when you think about development and measurement is if someone has OCD at 4 or has it at around teenage puberty years or has it in adults, the way the symptoms come up depend on developmental tasks and what is a focus. Similarly with autism, individuals may have restricted interests or things they're focused on. So young kids, cars, transportation, may know every detail about every car ever made. By the time they're teenagers, it could be gaming. And adults, all of these interest shifts. So development is a dimension that is challenging to measure. And so ideally you want to measure things that will go across development for disorders. So traditionally in clinical worlds, we like to give diagnoses that are very clean categories, but it's not how the brain works. So in the disorders, we've been talking about autism, OCD, tic disorders. They all have repetitive behaviors and obsessive compulsive behaviors. And there are similarities and differences, but there are a lot of similarities. And so sometimes if you don't study them and do research on them and actually think about the pathways from a neuroscience perspective, they're arbitrary distinctions, and treatments really can target across these different disorders. And as I mentioned, some children have more than one of these, and there's a lot of overlap. So around a third of individuals with OCD can have overlap with autism spectrum, and a greater number have autism traits. And autism overlaps similarly with both disorders. So they run in families together. There's genetic links between them because they have similar neural pathways. So our approach is to kind of take these symptoms, put them all together, and try to be able to measure symptoms in better ways than the separated bins and categories. And ultimately, treatments, if you do that, should also be able to overlap across these disorders as we think about them. Another thing is repetitive behaviors can be lower order or higher order, meaning that you can have simple movement disorders or tics, eye blinks, or simple movements like that, to very complex movements where it's pacing in a certain way back and forth. And there's also other behaviors that are related to the body and grooming and compulsive behaviors. And so again, the complexity of what you're trying to capture ranges tremendously, and severity of how this impacts day-to-day life ranges a lot, is a wide range. So as I mentioned earlier, the problem is if we have these self-reports, there's a bias. Some people aren't great at reporting how much something is impairing them. Similarly with children, whether someone has a language capacity to express it, often we're getting this information from parents and teachers, and their ability to pick up and observe is very different. So it's hard to measure things, and if you don't measure the symptoms, how do you know if a treatment is working? So things that we're doing is we're actually thinking about this from a neurodevelopmental perspective, brain pathways that overlap, timing that overlaps, and we are finding these separate categories to be less helpful. And this very much fits with what NIH has been suggesting, which is there are overlaps and research domain criteria and overlaps. And studying the basic neuroscience means studying how these different symptoms relate across disorders. And it links back to basic neuroscience. So you can even do animal models and look at things that way in terms of molecular mechanisms. So things that we've been approaching is looking at computational and technological approaches to look at variables across and within psychiatric disorders. But when I mention dimensions of complexity, people who study adult disorders often don't think about development and the difference in measuring in something in a young child versus an adult that may be the same disorder over time. With all the technology we have and our availability, we are now pulling together very, very large data sets. I'm involved in some very large projects in the US and in the world where there are over 50,000 individuals with autism for genetic studies or other things. So we're now getting to the level of being able to get these large data sets. And then the other thing to think about is the timing and capturing developmental data longitudinally, and thinking about how to use this large data and technology to optimize the time and training. So especially if you're doing an intervention, to do it at the right time for these individuals. Nikos and Vicky and Christine and many others of us in both computer science and psychiatry are working right now on a NSF project. And the idea of this is similar to what we said. If you can measure, for example, tic disorders or Tourette's, often we do video coding to see how frequent they are, or a person's report saying, I have a certain amount of tics or it's impairing me at a certain level. But computer technology, video and sensor technology can be tremendous in actually measuring how impairing these symptoms are, and how it helps us as clinicians is we can go back and say, if we're giving them a specific treatment, which could be biomedical, like a drug, or a therapeutic treatment where they learn to suppress or alter their behaviors, then we would have a way to measure the number of tics, the frequency, the severity, better than the standardized rating scales or clinician administered scales. So I'm going to talk about improving assessment. And one of the things that we know in disorders like autism and a lot of these neurodevelopmental disorders is the earlier you can assess and give a diagnosis, the earlier you can do interventions, and that improves outcomes. And part of the reason is the brain, if you have a challenge, say with autism at a very young age with communicating, and you're unable to communicate, you develop other strategies in order to get your needs met. And the earlier you're given alternative modes of communication, the less problematic behaviors develop. So early intervention is a key to a lot of the work we do. And so one thing I had mentioned, and this is recent data that we have with colleagues here, Amy Essler and Amy Hewitt have been working on it with the CDC in looking at age of diagnosis of autism, and that's really around 4 to 5. Minnesota is similar to other states in that later age, 4 to 5, is often when it's picked up. But as researchers, we know that under 2, you can pick up signs and signals. And one thing that we've been interested in doing is looking at community samples, so as well as clinic samples, and trying to figure out ways to move this to being able to pick up issues earlier. And so, as many of you know, with computational methods, you could have supervised models or unsupervised models, and you can combine them both. And with these large data sets that we're now able to amass, you can do waves of data collection and pick up these different patterns. And so for this first study that we have funded, Jed Ellison and I are working on this together, funded through NIH. We are doing a community sample where we're looking at babies in the community that have signed up to do research. Parents actually have signed up to do the research from 17 to 25-month-old, using, as I mentioned, those rating scales that have been established that clinicians are used to using, but getting parents to describe these initial children at these ages and where they are. And one of the challenges, our children are very variable and diverse. And if any of you have had more than one child, the age that someone started talking may vary, walking and crawling. I mean, there's some window of ages that vary. Boys and girls may be slightly different, but children have a variability in terms of these behavior. But then if you have these different disorders or risks for disorders, you have more variability. So by first getting the parental information via online data collection, we are then using computer models or computational algorithms to decide if there are different children at risk. And then bringing them in, getting more data, and then doing a full assessment up through age 3 to identify those that have clear disorders or risks for disorders. And this NIH project is we are working, Jed and Jason Wolf and I are working with Michael Steinbeck and Vipin Kumar and some of the models, as well as initially we had a few models proposed, and now we've added to that. And the goal is the best way to pick up the children at risk and bring them back. And initially, it's unsupervised, but over time, as you have data from the 3-year-olds, you can go back and refine the approach of who can come back. And this may be a future way of helping to screen and identify children at risk based on information parents have of children when they're at home. And so this was the preliminary data that we had used, and some of the items on the left, on the y-axis, have to do with age, gestures, amount of words that are used, various social behaviors, restricted behaviors or repetitive behaviors that I had mentioned earlier at this early age. And you put all these symptom items together and then can use them to help predict level of risk and do various things like anomaly detection, which we're doing with Vipin and Michael's group, as well as we've done other clustering approaches as well. And through those, the goal is to see which kids will end up with autism or related disorders. This original project also has brain imaging for 2-year-olds. Right now with the pandemic, we're holding off on the imaging. I just was looking at numbers today. We have already 1,000 children where we've done this initial screening, and several hundred where we've done the follow-up, now online assessments. But hopefully in the latter years of the grant, we'll be able to bring them in for the imaging and in-person assessments. And as mentioned, many of these disorders have similar pathways that are affected. So in addition to autism, if children have risks for other related neurodevelopmental disorders, it'll be interesting to see if this approach is a way to screen and identify. And having a community sample is important because clinical samples are children that are often at high risk for various disorders have already come in, but these are are children that are at large, not necessarily seeing physicians for problems. So this may be a way to help families and pediatricians figure out a way to pick up risk early. The other thing that technology is amazing at doing is picking up information that isn't coming through rating scales. So eye tracking is one thing in terms of eye movements, where an individual looks during an interaction or on the screen. But the other thing we're also doing is task performance. So various games and tasks for attention, problem solving, and using these different kinds of tasks. And with kids, it's especially fun because you can create creative game tasks to get better at diagnosing and seeing, especially the children that have a combination of these things. One thing I haven't mentioned is ADHD, which overlaps with all the 3 disorders we've been talking about. So a task performance can pick up attention issues. And so I can talk about some of this data. And if you look, let's see if the videos go on, individuals without autism often look at faces in terms of eye and mouth and face overall to detect emotion or social situations. Individuals with autism tend not to look at the eyes as much. And so where an individual looks at a face and to pick up and gauge social information is useful in terms of identifying individuals with autism. And so this is one of the reasons eye tracking has been an area that's been of great interest over the years in autism. And so we have been collaborating. This is interesting because I had, we've been collecting eye tracking data, but with this eye tracking data, you can capture a lot of information. The length, if you're having them do a task, you can see how the length of time of each stimulus, how they respond, the watching, the relative reaction time to responding to, say, the emotion of a face, the amount of fixation and fixation per second. You can also do detailed eye tracking like saccades, which are specific eye movements, or length of fixation per trial. And in collaboration with Catherine Zhao's lab and our lab, we've had a graduate student and postdoc, Ming and Sunday, work on a project where we've looked at this eye tracking data and tried to use machine learning in predicting social symptoms and or autism. And so the task we use here is video face tasks where you're watching the face change from neutral to an emotion, and the participant has to then state which emotion that the individual has on the screen. And we have run, you know, a number of typically developing kids as well as those with neurodevelopmental disorders. And the average age is around 12 in the sample. Mostly with autism. Many have both autism and ADHD, and a smaller subset only have ADHD. And we also collect rating scale data on their social responsiveness scale, which picks up some levels of autism symptoms, and the repetitive behavior scale. So one of the things that's really interesting in collaborating with Ming and Catherine is using computational approaches instead of our standard approaches in analyzing this data. So with eye fixation, so what we've been able to do with them is that you can take response time percent correct and also look at the number of fixations and look at the correlations, and also look at spatial distribution of eye fixation when they are looking at the face. And so Ming was able to divide the face into 6x6 bins and look at the number of fixations and aggregate for each group. And through this, we were able to see that ASD participants had higher fixation density on the background and decreased gazing in the eye region, which is consistent with the literature and other people who have done this study. So when you go back and do further, hold on, let me go, I think I skipped a slide on this, do random forest regression, you can, for each trial, that fixation map can be converted into the 36-dimensional feature vector, and then looked across task features. So then with this analysis, PCA was performed to transform the 16-dimensional vector, and random forest regressor was trained to predict the assessments in the subscales. And the subscales are the two that look to the level of autism symptoms. SRS is a little bit more on social symptoms, and RBSR is the repetitive behavior symptoms. And then Ming and Catherine helped us leave out and do training processes to evaluate the regressor. And data from one participant was left out as testing data, and the rest were used for training. And then the results were averaged across all trials. The process was repeated 60 times as each participant, so that each participant was tested once. And the testing was combined and evaluated. And here are the results with the SRS, which is more of a social measure, and it predicts that the SRS subscales correlate independently, social cognition, social motivation, social communication. And then there's separation. If you look at the colors here, the typically developing individuals are green, the pink are autism. We have fewer ADHD participants, but you can see that they separate out and they don't look the same as those with autism. And then the combined ASD, ADHD. And this is of particular interest because, I'm going to go forward, sorry. Because if an individual has autism and ADHD, treating them in social skills training without addressing their ADHD may create challenges or problems. And tasks like this can help us determine if they fit in to these combined issues or single issues. And then even as a clinician, I would be interested in seeing if you would vary the treatment strategy across someone who has autism plus ADHD versus autism without ADHD. The repetitive behavior scale, which is also another issue with autism, showed an overall correlation, but not for the subscales. But there still is a separation between typically developing as well as autism. And so so when you look and you compare with these three tasks, the DARE is the task, which is not used at all in standard clinical, but it's a task of eye tracking. Well, we did eye tracking with face. SRS and RBSR rating scales. You can look that these can be used to predict, and DARE in particular does a really good job of predicting autism versus non-autism. And so these machine learning model-based approaches looking at behavioral features of neurodevelopmental disorders with something like this emotion recognition task in eye tracking allows us to make predictions and may help with diagnostic tools for autism, specifically if you're looking for comorbidities with something like autism and ADHD. And one of the things we do need to do is, as I mentioned, since we're really interested in development, is expand this across age ranges. Our mean age was right around 12, but there is more developmental data saying eye tracking and how information is taken up can change with adulthood versus younger children. There may be sex differences, male-female differences, and how these things are approached. Increasing our ADHD sample to see those without autism and how it's useful in that subgroup, and seeing how generalizable these kind of tasks are. Physicians and clinicians like rating scales because they can be pencil and paper done, but as we have more computers and technology, these kind of computational tasks are going to be new and improved ways to kind of do these assessments. My final set of data is related to how you would use computational approaches or computer technology to think about treatments. And as I mentioned before, in the eye tracking, if you know an individual has ADHD and autism, you may want to do executive functioning or focus level training or interventions before you do social skills training, because an individual may not be able to get much out of a social skills training if they can't pay attention to it. And so the sequence of what you learn when, aside from even development, is really important. And then the other thing is, as we know, kids are, some children may enjoy learning things on a computer more than face-to-face. And our goal is, with most things, especially in disorders like autism where social information is really important, to have it apply to real life social situations. So in some of the, one of our future projects, we're actually going to pair computerized training with online social skills training. And ultimately, it would be interesting to see how this affects face-to-face social abilities. And so with these kind of treatments, you're able to get different types of data and come up with creative new interventions. And many of these treatments, as similar to the way we've been doing assessments, may not only help one particular group, like higher functioning autism, but may also help individuals with OCD or tic disorders. And so that is something that we're exploring as we're developing it. And then developmental sensitivity and personalizing it becomes an opportunity. Many of the games we do are things that kids or teenagers will enjoy. And we've actually been surprised that adults often enjoy these more creative games than as well. So we're trying to develop things that will go across development. And this is very different from my colleagues who study a lot of adults and don't have either the data or the type of games that would work for children at a broader age. So in this project, we're partnering with Brain HQ, which is a company that focuses on computerized training games. And originally, a lot of these games were developed for aging-related tasks, to prevent dementia, those kind of things. And the reason we went with this group and some of these games is Sofia Vinogrado, who's my department chair, has used some of these games and strategies with schizophrenia patients and has had published really interesting results. And so I was curious if these similar games would make a difference with autism. And Angela Seng, who's the Ph.D. in our lab, has been helping us with this project. And one of the ideas is, when you think about this kind of targeted treatment, how do you plug it in, a cognitive training study? And so these studies are long, and the goal is people come in and they're assessed. And then we've had 2 cognitive training. One is a auditory training process, computer training, and another is a social cognitive training, which has a lot of face tasks and facial emotional processing. And so the 2 areas of development that I'm really interested in kind of thinking about in terms of designing training or treatments is, as I mentioned earlier, the before the young age, under 3 and even under 5 and 6, when language is developed, there's a lot of change with the auditory cortex and thinking about language and development. So that's sort of a critical period for many of these early interventions. But in adolescence, there's also a critical period where the brain really develops again, and a lot of social behaviors emerge. And so the idea is to create these games and tasks in teens as well, and see if there can be shifts in their abilities to do things. So we've been targeting teenagers and young adults over the age of 12 up until in their early 20s, mostly with autism. And then we are more recently trying to get control participants as well as a comparison sample. But these are long projects, and this is something we were able to do at home because these computer games and training games can be done at home. The assessments we had been doing in the lab, and they're standardized psychological assessments. And one of the things, we're trying to get individuals who can participate that don't have other medical issues or intellectual disabilities, so make it challenging to participate in these training games. So these games do match to the ability of the user, and they do get rewards with points, and we have follow-up and a weekly reinforcement. They get a certain amount of money per week if they've spent the time doing the game. So these are teenagers. And the 2 modules, they're randomized either to the auditory or the social. And you may ask why auditory? And so the social one, it's pretty obvious with autism, but auditory, there's been a lot of studies with early childhood and auditory to help with language and processing. But in schizophrenia, there's data that even the auditory module actually improves overall function. And so I'm intrigued by this because there may be something about the process of learning, pulling in sensory information in sequence that then in turn affects social and general behavior. So to date, these are long project studies. So you're involved for 10 to 12 months playing games, many days of the week. Often it's 4 times a week. And so these are our older numbers. We have, it's slightly higher now, but about 10 and 10 have completed auditory and social. And preliminary data shows that there is a general improvement in their abilities to actually do the standardized tasks within the auditory and social tasks of what they're training. We're really interested in looking at these clinical measures to see if there's a change. And if you look pre and post, there seems to be also early data that shows some improvement on quality of life overall with these modules, as well as decreased restrictive behaviors. And then we're also interested in executive functioning and looking at specific ways of thinking or paying attention. And some of these have also shown improvement from before and after. And so one specific thing with executive functioning, you can see before the intervention in both groups were not doing great in terms of the auditory and social module, but afterwards they improved. And this correlates with an independent test assessing their executive functioning ability. So when you think about all these different approaches, the idea is that, as you know, as a physician scientist, and I'm involved in genetics and epigenetics, clinical trials, and a range of different treatments. But the idea is that people with disorders have differences, and you have to optimize the right intervention at the right dose at the right time for the right person. And historically, with statistics and approaches, we take averages and come up with an average treatment that's supposed to help everyone. And that's not successful in many disorders, not only neurodevelopmental disorders. And we now have the computational and data ability to improve upon these approaches and look at individual differences and heterogeneity to customize treatments using technology. And, you know, as we go through and we collect more data and have real-time processing and quick analysis, we're able to get information back to make decisions. And previously, things like development seem really overwhelming or difficult. But with a combination of large data sets where we can have increased numbers, as well as computational models and methods, we are now able to integrate that data together and start putting things together for these very complex disorders. And so this is a summary of the range of different things our lab does. So in addition to some of the computational modeling, Christine and I am helping her doing some neuromodulation, so non-invasive brain stimulation. We often use neuroimaging to look at brain circuits that are affected. I mentioned the cognitive training study. We have some interest in microbiome and brain-body interactions. We have been part of novel clinical trials with new treatments that are medications targeting autism, some of which are related to systems that I've done basic science research in, and trying to see if that makes a difference. And currently there are no drugs targeting autism specifically. We're part of a large genetics study where that's one of the ones I mentioned, where we're partnering across the country with over 50,000 individuals participating. And a lot of this requires a lot of community outreach, and technology has allowed us to start developing networks. We have a network called the Find Network, where we're really trying to get ways to communicate with families who are interested not only in research, but in sharing knowledge across to regionally and updating people. And so, as mentioned, this is a huge group of people and collaborators. And one of the wonderful things about one of my favorite things about Minnesota is it's been an incredible place to collaborate, and it's been especially fun to collaborate with computer science because it's one of the strengths, and similar to the neuroimaging, there are technological opportunities here that are not in other places, but that people are very willing to come up with ideas, talk about ideas, seek funding. I do think that that's a unique thing about our community. And so thank you, and I look forward to some questions.
Thank you, Suma. Great talk. Any questions?
Can you tell us a little bit more about the auditory? And I guess I'm curious. Like, is this like auditory cognition, or like
Yeah.
what?
Yep, it's really interesting because there some of the games are very basic sensory games. So one of them is called sound sweeps. So a sound goes up or down and you have to detect it. And it's really interesting because it's non-intuitive how getting better at that helps. And sort of a more general hypothesis I have about that is it allows you, one, to develop your ability to listen more carefully, but then also notice patterns. And a lot of individuals with these disorders and our culture is very visuospatial. We spend a lot of time on the computer and don't develop those auditory things unless it's your natural inclination. And so I think it helps to train being able to focus on those differences, and then that has an impact on social behaviors. So that's just, those are all hypotheses as to why it's working. But it's really exciting and fun to think that training your brain on some of these basic sensory processes can then affect better performance overall and less symptoms.
Yeah, I was curious, from the point of view of the auditorily impaired community. So like people like my brother, for example, profoundly deaf. I was wondering if there were any links between sensory deficits and these what you're looking at, but I guess not from your answer, because from your answer, somebody who has a sensory deficit would just focus on the other senses. And so it wouldn't necessarily, like the lack of auditory ability wouldn't be a factor.
So it depends, again, it goes back to the developmental window of looking at it. And I've been interested in this data for a long time because a large number of individuals with autism have language delays. And they don't, when you test children, they don't have primary sensory auditory problems, but they're slow in developing language. And so more complex language and auditory processing may be affected. But what you really notice when you even think about individuals that are deaf is if you're really great at gestural abilities or other ways of communicating, it's not impairing. But if you're not, and you have an auditory deficit, then you're at higher risk for something like autism because this is your main way of socially engaging and you don't have these other strengths of alternative social engagement. So development and what your other strengths are a big factor. And there's some ideas that the differences between boys and girls are related to those kind of things because there may be other strengths that come in that compensate for certain deficits between the two groups.
Now that's fascinating. I was talking to somebody from the speech language hearing department, and she was telling me that they found a relationship between age-related hearing loss and cognitive decline. And it sounded very similar to what you were talking about, where you don't get that stimulation from the auditory, and so then you start disconnecting socially, and then it starts leading to all of these other sort of knock-on things that, like, why would not being able to hear make you like less able to plan? But you just sort of explained it. So thank you.
Other questions?
Suma, this is Raj. You talked a little bit about repetitive motions and how they might, will they also increase with the disease? Can you tell us a little bit more about what types of motions?
So that's when I had that one slide that had so many different kinds of motions. So early age, if there's and there's a correlation with repetitive behaviors that highly goes with intellectual disability. So if there's cognitive challenges and lower IQs, there tend to be more repetitive behaviors. Other kind of physical repetitive behaviors can even, like higher functioning autism, there can be some repetitive behaviors like hand movements or fascination with movements or fingered movements, subtle motor kind of things. And then it's really interesting, these tick behaviors. Normal, typical kids sometimes have these repetitive behaviors and they come and go and they pass along in development. But I even used to remember watching my daughter's second grade class. If you go to a performance and everyone's stressed and they're singing in class, you'll see a bunch of tic behaviors in the kids as they're nervous. Many of those will go away and a subset will be, not impairing, but there are all these repetitive motor overflow behaviors at various points in development. The challenge is when it becomes more severe and it interferes with functioning. And so some people have very complex, they're called stereotypies, and then a subset have vocal word repetitions, and some of the bigger challenges, if you've seen stories of individuals with Tourette's, are swear words or other things that come out that they can't inhibit or control, and so those create a lot of challenges. So the range of repetitive movements can vary greatly with IQ and disorder and overlap. But when some people imagine autism and hand flapping and some of those disorders, it's a subset of individuals with those kind of repetitive disorders. And then there's another where we call higher order that really overlaps with OCD. A lot of these individuals have more complex compulsive behaviors that are more what we would see as OCD kind of behaviors as well.
Okay.
And one of the things that's kind of fun about studying them versus social behaviors, as you can imagine going through development, social behaviors are so complex, but we might be able to use technology to better measure these repetitive behaviors in a way.
Yeah, so that was like my question. So you showed that the correlation metrics where you list a lot of the activities, and then you show that the correlation, and so here when you do this classification of this activities, how do you do so? I mean, do you manually identify the clip of video that correspond to some specific activities, or is this like some automated way to do the classification?
So I'm trying to, the videos were set, like it's a standardized task. So set number of faces, set number of responses. And so I'm trying to get your question. We did it various different ways where like before you did the modeling, you could do regions of interest and just look within those, before we started collaborating. The traditional way is you can do regions of interest and look at eye tracking and saying where they're looking at within those given time periods within a given face over time. But the model will look at all the different times they're looking at a face and try to look at, instead of these regions that are created to map the eyes, put it in bins, and then look based on the bins they go into, whether it's more likely that they're typically developing or ASD. And so those individuals with ASD tend to look less at the eyes. As a neurodevelopmentalist, I'm very curious whether some of those individuals had language delay. And so as you're learning language, if you're spending a lot of time looking at someone's mouth or doing that, who knows, it's not, you may never learn this ability of sort of auditorily processing language. You may be always looking at other places, but most individuals that have typical language development hone in, you can hear it and pick up, you're looking for additional social information, and the eyes often give the most social information of whether someone's paying attention to you, whether they're engaged, whether they're bored, and even the emotion piece. And it feels like that there's, it's not where individuals with autism look, and you can just, in some ways, some areas, some people have found, like Ami Klin's work, a lot of looking in the mouth. Other people's will see it off the eyes, like edges or distortions of the face. But this data was predictive of what we already know, that it happens. And the SRS data and the RBSR meant the higher the scores, which you expect higher scores of social dysfunction or repetitive behavior, correlated with that atypical pattern of looking versus a typically developing folks.
No, I think it was you answered more than what I asked. What I asked was so you showed a lot of classification of activities such as like repetitive video, the activities and so on. And I was wondering that where do you get this classification? So I always imagine that you watch the video of children interacting with someone, some people, some parents, and then you one of like annotators go to the videos and annotate the video clips. I don't know what was the setting of that the experiments and how do you annotate those?
So there are those kind of video ratings, and those are often for motor behavior, so tic disorders. I thought you were asking about the face data, which that is a highly experimental setting, where you come in and you look at a screen and you're a set amount of space from it and getting that eye tracking data. So that's very much of an experimental model. The other models of doing, Christine is actually trying to do work where someone at home will look at a screen and you collect the tic behavior. And most data we have, a parent and a child comes in and they're doing an assessment, and you have cameras at set places and you're collecting it. It's sort of random whether you will get a repetitive behavior that can even be coded in there, because you're not eliciting it often. But often that's the way you get that kind of data, and it's harder. It's always tough because with something like tic disorder, you have a lot of, it's a frequent thing, so it's easy to capture. With autism, sometimes it's not as easy to capture. You have to have a lot more data to capture some of those repetitive behaviors.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? So let me ask one, because this is something that I think is interesting. I mean, how is the community of psychiatrists and psychologists view this introduction of computational tools? 10 years ago plus, when Kelvin approached me, the majority of the psychiatrists were very negative. I mean, do you see a change? Do you see wide adoption of these methodologies, or still we have the same split?
Yep. So I think people in the community want things that are easy to do. So pen and paper rating, even that isn't necessarily easy to do, but it's something that they can do. I do see a change because I think in the past, we were really trying to have these very neat, clean disorders and less of an idea that there's a lot of overlap. So an individual with autism and ADHD would need something different than an individual with just autism. But these pen and paper tests don't even tell us a great idea if they have one or both. And so there's more respect for the idea of what computational information can bring. And I do think ultimately, if they're doing these computational things in a place or space that's not often taking up clinical time or making the medical personnel's life more complex, then they're open to it. So the study I'm doing with Jed, when the families are filling up around 45 minutes, 30 minutes to 45 minutes of questionnaires. Families are doing that at home, and they're not, you know, and so if they get that data and they send it, and then the clinician can see it and it gives them information, I think they're much more open. I think clinicians are not open to kind of changing the status quo of their practice, where there's more work to do within a visit than they have time to do. So I think in addition to the clinicians wanting to change, being accepting of it, I think people are more accepting of doing these things on their own and in their own time. And that might be changing how individuals feel about it.
Okay, thank you very much.